Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through, where we present analysis of foreign policy and domestic politics that cuts through the noise of corporate and ideologically driven media. I'm Mitchell Plitnick, the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and the author of the Cutting Through newsletter on Substack. You can support this work by going to mitchellplitnick.substack.com and subscribing to Cutting Through. You can become a free subscriber and help spread the word, let other people know to subscribe as well. You can also become a paid subscriber and give me the support I need to continue doing this work. Either way, it'll be deeply appreciated. There was an ugly scene in Congress earlier this week. The Republican senator from Louisiana, John Kennedy, used unbelievably hateful language in his interrogation, frankly, of the executive director of the Arab America Institute, Maya Berry. He repeatedly asked Maya if she supported Hamas, despite the fact that she repeatedly said she did not. He actually said to her that she supported Hezbollah and Hamas, and grouped Hezbollah and Hamas absurdly with UNRWA, as if these are similar organizations in any way. Finally, he told Maya that she should have her head in a bag, whatever that exactly means, but it certainly sounds rather threatening, unpleasant, and certainly quite racist. The entire scene was revolting. And even some members of Congress have spoken out and said that this was unacceptable behavior. Interestingly, Kennedy does not seem to be facing censure for his repulsive behavior, his blatant racism on the floor of Congress. Simply some criticism from all too few, frankly, of his colleagues. One of the most disturbing aspects of Kennedy's behavior is that he did this and he said these things that were so clearly motivated by anti-Arab hatred. While sitting just behind Maya Berry was a woman named Hanan Shaheen. Hanan is a Palestinian American citizen who lives in Illinois and whose son, Wadea al-Fayoume, I hope I got his name right, was murdered by their landlord. Wadea was 6 years old and was stabbed over 24 times by a white man who was fueled with anti-Arab hatred just after the events of October 7th. He had heard hate speech very similar to the kind of garbage that Senator Kennedy was spewing at Maya, and Wadea paid the price. Hanan was also stabbed dozens of times and was forced to miss her son's funeral because she was still recovering from her wounds. This was a 6-year-old boy. I cannot stress that enough. And it certainly made the headlines at the time. We certainly heard about this. But when we think about the fact that we have a case like Wadea, we have cases of Arab students at Stanford University, for example, being run over by cars, of other students in Vermont being shot in the street because they wore keffiyehs. That is something that we should all be taking very seriously as a wave of hate crimes that grips the country. But that's not what we hear about. We hear about the fact that some Jewish students are made uncomfortable by campus protests against Israel's genocide in Gaza. There's a separation of values here that is unacceptable. This is not to say that the concerns of Jewish students should be ignored, although they should be taken in context. The idea that you go to college and you face a protest and you don't like the protest and you don't agree with the protesters and you feel that the protesters are being unfair, well, you have to live with that. We all do. We all see demonstrations. We all see political speech that we don't like. This is part of living in a democracy. On the other hand, if Jewish students face harassment, intimidation, threats of physical violence, that absolutely must be dealt with. As somebody who has friends and relatives who are Jewish students, including my own son, who is currently a student in a university, that is a central concern for me, and I would think everybody. But the evidence just doesn't support the same kind of concerns that we've seen about Muslim and Arab Americans. And we can talk about this various hate crime statistics, but they don't really tell us anything. Um, we know that hate crimes are criminally underreported, more so in marginalized communities, as one would expect, which is also where most hate crimes happen. So the statistics that we have are far, far, far from accurate. This focus on campus so-called anti-Semitism, which in many cases is simply anti-Zionism, which is not anti-Semitism by any reasonable definition of those two words, although the two things can go together, but that does not make them the same thing. The idea that political speech is the same as hate speech is unacceptable. But we actually have severe instances of violence. Only recently, a young Palestinian girl was nearly drowned at a public swimming pool for no reason other than being an Arab child. This should be what we're talking about, and it isn't. Wadea's death did certainly make headlines, but it faded from those headlines, and it was buried under far less egregious and serious crimes. Because, frankly, as a 6-year-old Arab American, his life was not valued properly. And coming back to Senator Kennedy's repulsive behavior, let's also keep in mind he did nothing to acknowledge Wadea's mother, Hanan Shaheen, excuse me, who was sitting right there. A woman who, I have to say, I mean, when I hear her speak and I hear her talk about how many people have been supportive of her and how she looks for the love in the world and everyone, and I just don't even comprehend how she can have that attitude, how she can hold on to that much of her humanity after what happened to her and her son. But she does, and she's a remarkable woman, and that the members of Congress who were intent on using a hearing, which was about hate crimes, incidentally, to commit hate crimes of their own, couldn't even spare a second to acknowledge the pain and the tragedy and the heroism of Hanan Shaheen and the death of her son. I think tells us a lot of what we need to know about anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian racism in our country. And this is not just about getting up on a high horse and talking about somebody who's as obviously and blatantly a white supremacist as Senator John Kennedy. This has real effects on policy and big ones. This week, 972 magazine published an article by Ibrahim Mohammed. And Ibrahim documented the publishing of the names, as many names as the Gaza Health Ministry has, of the people who have been slaughtered by Israel since October 7th in Gaza. It is an incomplete list. The official death toll is over 41,000, and that is not counting a great many people who are missing, whose fate is unknown, people whose deaths have not been reported because their bodies haven't been discovered. Some 7,000 to 8,000 people who the Gaza Health Ministry does have custody of their bodies, but they can't identify them. They don't know who they are. And of course, it does not take into account all the people who died from the so-called collateral effects of war, as well as Israel's deliberate starvation of Gaza, deprivation of water, contamination of the water that is there. All the things Yoav Galan promised he would do on the very first day of the war, which Israel has followed through on and has been as good as its word. So it is a short list, at least it's a long list, but it's a list that is not as long as it could be. It is not an exhaustive list, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Out of the some 34,000, it's what's the number? 34,344. I said, well, actually, let me read you the opening paragraph of Ibrahim's article. On September 16th, Gaza's health ministry released a 649-page document containing the personal information of 34,344 Palestinians killed by Israel's onslaught on the enclave over the past 11 months. The seemingly endless list is incomplete. More than 41,000 Palestinians have been martyred since October 7th, according to health ministry figures, but many of them have not yet been fully identified. Over 11,300 of the identified victims are children, and 710 of them were killed before they turned 1 year of age. We need to stop and think about that. 710 infants and more. There have certainly been more. I mean, when we're talking about especially people who are buried and can't be found under rubble, obviously infants are harder to find. But also, and I think more to the point, when we're talking about people who die from these ancillary effects of the lack of food, lack of medicine, just malnutrition, dehydration, the things that happen when you lay siege to an already vastly overpopulated area that had been impoverished after years and years of siege by Israel. A lot more of those babies that are dead. That's a lot right there, 710. It should be something that sets everyone's blood boiling and says, we have to stop this. It has to stop. It has to be ended. And of course, there are many of us who are saying that, but not nearly enough, especially in the United States, the one country that really has the power to stop this, to put an almost immediate end to it. There is certainly a significant protest movement. There is a significant number of people who, when asked, vast majorities of Democrats want a ceasefire and believe that pressure should be put on Israel to attain one. And that includes withholding arms shipments and things of that nature. But not enough. And it's only when they're asked. They're not hounding their members of Congress, inundating the White House and State Department with letters and phone calls saying, this has to stop. This is blood that's on our hands. And it's the blood of babies, not even just children, babies, that is on our hands. I feel it very powerfully as a Jewish American who unfortunately knows way too many other Jewish Americans who support this monstrosity. But I also know so many of my fellow Jews who are passionately and tirelessly opposing it. And that is really, really important. But what I think right now is disturbing to me is how we have now 710 names of infants that have been slaughtered over the past 11 months who are under the age of 1 year old. Let's remember what happened on October 7th and after October 7th. Israel put out all sorts of stories that have since been debunked. One of the things that I have repeatedly brought up in these last 11 months in my writing, those of you who followed my writing will see it, is that Israel's been repeatedly caught fabricating stories about October 7th, embellishing other stories. And I have to ask why. Because what Hamas and other groups and individuals did on October 7th was plenty horrible. There was, and I say that as somebody who also supports the right of any occupied people to resist. And yes, they have the right, though I don't think maybe it's the best option, but they have the right, and it's their option to resist with the use of force. That is simple, not only logic, but when you are living under a brutal military occupation, to say only the occupation can use force is obviously unjust. Do I think it's the best idea? No. But That is up to Palestinians. That said, that right is not limitless. And many, many, many of the things that happened that we know happened on October 7th um, went far beyond what an occupied people is permitted under international law, and I think under just common sense and basic ethics to do. That should have been enough. But Israel felt the need to embellish that and bring in horrific lies. Why? One must ask. Why? And the reason I think is very obvious, because if this was just a terrorist attack, as we've seen so many over the years, I do not believe, and I think the Israeli government did not believe, that they could sustain the kind of operation that they wanted to undertake in response, which was, in fact, the kind that Yoav Gallant described. No food, no water, no electricity, no medicine, no nothing gets into Gaza while we go in and destroy the place. That is what they wanted to do. Now, when you say that's what you're going to do, that's a call for genocide. It is literally the definition of genocide. You cannot get more of a declaration of genocide without saying we are about to commit genocide. That's what that was. And I think that is why these facts needed to be embellished. And embellished they were. And the worst part is when we talk about some of the things that were said that happened on October 7th that have either been debunked or have not been proven, they are some of the most powerful, motivating tools that pro-Israel forces, Israel itself, and the United States government repeatedly use to justify what's going on. We know there was some sexual assault on October 7th. We do not know the extent of it. We know that Israel is responsible for the death of some of the Israelis who were killed. We don't know how many. We know it's not one or two. There have been very clear and proven examples of that sort of thing happening. But maybe the most pernicious and the most powerful tool that Israel used was this story about murdered babies, beheaded babies in some versions, just murdered in others. It was a lie. It was simply untrue. One baby was tragically killed on October 7th by Hamas forces when they shot into the car where the baby was being held by her, I do not know, I'm sorry, I do not know the gender of the baby, but by their mother. The mother was killed as well. That in and of itself is a horror. But what was brought out by Israel was that dozens of babies had been killed and had been killed intentionally. And that lie was repeatedly, not once, it was not a mistake, was repeatedly reinforced by the President of the United States. That gives it a power that it cannot have by itself. That is something very, very significant. And it worked. It motivated a lot of people here in the States. It certainly resonated in Israel. And even though people who follow the news know that this story has been debunked, first, many people don't follow the news that closely and don't know that that story has been debunked. So they still believe it. But even people who know that it's been debunked, that story still framed their entire approach to October 7th, what happened that day, and how Israel should respond to it. That lie is responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people. And yet, somehow, the reality, the truth, the fact that 710 plus infants under the age of 1 have been killed by Israel in Gaza, that can't motivate it to stop. So a lie helped to motivate the not the response itself, but certainly the scope and the size of the response and the heartlessness and the brutality of the response. That lie helped to shape that response. But the truth can't put a stop to it. The truth isn't in the headlines. Where are the stories Where are the stories in the New York Times, on CNN, and the Washington Post telling us about 710 infants under the age of 1 who have been killed? And that's not even to mention the ones who have permanent disabilities, permanent life altering injuries. And then we can talk about how many of them will be traumatized for the rest of their lives. And that's just talking about the number of victims who are under the age of 1. So much more when we're talking about children. Again, the ministry's figures had, as of September 16th, 11,300 children killed. And again, think about how many of them have life-threatening injuries. How many of them have lost their families? How many of them will be permanently emotionally scarred by having experienced this kind of brutality at this young an age? I mean, if nothing else, if we don't care about these lives, if we don't care about these babies, we don't care about these children, how about the Israelis that are going to have to live with the results of this, the trauma of this, and how many of those people themselves are going to feel a life that is hopeless, where they have nothing else to turn to but to try and take out some measure of vengeance on those that have done this to them? Where do you think that's going to leave the future? Is that going to bring safety and security to Israel, if that's all you care about? But it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be about that. It should be about the lives of children. But as we saw in Congress, the lives of children are only important when they're not Arab, when they're not Muslim, certainly when they're not Palestinian. That's a start. They also have to not be black. They have to not be brown in any way. Certainly for a trash person like John Kennedy, that would be the case. This kind of racism, and for many people, it's an unconscious racism. You ask them, you ask most people who actually are responding this way, whether they see it or not. You ask them, would you say that a Jewish child is more important than an Arab child just because they're Jewish? And they would say, no, of course not. But the fact is, that is how they react, and that is how they feel, because we don't care about the 710 babies that were killed. We care about the 40 babies that Hamas didn't kill. We need to think about this, and we need to think about how we're treating this, because this is a genocide that is ongoing and horrific and spreading. Right now, it's spreading to Lebanon. It will spread farther as long as we let Israel do this. The state of Israel has been taken over by a brand of nationalism that we know only too well from many countries in history. I'm not making any one direct comparison. We have seen what extreme nationalism does, and that is what Israel is in the grip of. And rather than putting the brakes on it, as we must, the United States, the Biden administration, has been encouraging it. Please like and share this video. If you find it of value, please tell your friends to subscribe. Please support this work. And please do what you can. Contact your member of Congress, contact the State Department, contact the White House, and tell them you don't want to see any more babies, whether it's in Gaza or in Israel or in Lebanon. You don't want to see any more killed. Thank you.